for joining. I am going to start on the hour just to make sure we finish on time. As Dragan mentioned, please keep yourself muted while during the presentation, but feel free, of course, to raise your hand and I will happily unmute you. There will be parts for Q&As after each section of my presentation, and I will be absolutely happy to have a back and forth with all of you. I will be monitoring the chat, but again, I will be going through the questions after each section just to make sure I don't lose my train of thought. That being said, my name is Kristina Huidu. I'm the product specialist for Dimensions. I am very, very happy to be here today, although I would have preferred we had this workshop in person. It would have been a lot more fun because you could have also had access to the API and we would have been able to do some of exercises and some testing together. But I hope some of the things that I prepared will be interesting and useful enough, and looking forward to all of your questions and feedback. This is the agenda for today. So first, to explain a little bit what is Dimensions, how was the data brought in there, and of course the disambiguation part, which was the main focus of my presentation. But because we do have 2 hours, and again, we cannot play with the API live, well, with you guys in the same room. I also added 3 more things to talk about today, and that is the classify function, the extract concepts one, and extract grants, and I will explain each of them. In between, there's a 10-minute break in case you want, just get yourself some water or some coffee, or just stretch your legs. Also, I really hope you are well and safe, and maybe next year we will get to meet in person. Let's see. So what is Dimensions? Dimensions, you can think of it as the next generation ANI database. But what we really, how we really describe it is a linked research data platform. And that's because traditional ANI databases focus mainly on publications and citations, but we strongly believe that is only part of the conversation when it comes not only to research impact, but also to research output and the whole ecosystem really, which looks a bit more like this. So you have publications that influence patents, you have grants that in turn will turn into publications, and people will talk about it on social media. And get to educate the wider public as well. Of course, there is policy documents that end up changing the way we live. So there's a whole story that goes well beyond publications and citations. And that is why we chose to build Dimensions. And it's not just a circular kind of database. It is interconnected and also very open. And as we would go through the presentation today, I hope I will do a pretty good job at explaining that this is not a boxed system. You don't just get into Dimensions and you are forced to use, well, forced is probably a strong word. You don't have to use the metrics that are available there. And you don't really have to use the user interface at all, as there are many different ways of extracting the data and using it in the system that you are comfortable with or that you need. And there are, we do bring data from multiple different sources. But when it comes to publications, our goal was to be inclusive rather than being the ones that decide which publications are or aren't relevant. But rather than doing that, we want to empower you to decide what is a relevant publication and have that conversation with you. And I would really like to hear from you how you do your research assessment. What is a relevant publication or relevant journal from your perspective? And what would be, I guess, the metrics or the thought process that you would apply to such a decision? So we have 110 million publications to date in various different languages. There is no need to have a mandatory abstract in English. So it can be in Mandarin, it can be in Dutch, it can be in really any other language out there. Also, the majority of those publications are indexed in full text. So similar to how you would search in Google, for example, you would also search in the full body of the actual article or book that we would have indexed. And the other two things that I'm kind of excited about when I start doing my own analyses are the article level classifications. So we don't apply journal level classification, and I will get into that a bit later, but rather use an article level classification by understanding what the article is actually about, regardless of where it was published, and also all the linkages to all the other content types. So you would be able to see which publications have been mentioned in clinical trials, and who are the investigators of those clinical trials. Are they sponsored by companies? So you can create a whole analysis just by using these linkages and not using actual citation metrics at all. And then when it comes to grants, you would find awarded grants in dimensions. There are about 5 million of them. And because we are still in the middle of a pandemic, that probably all of you are a bit tired of right now, but I thought it would be interesting to see that there are already 102 research grants captured in the database working on coronaviruses. And they're all based on research that has already been published, but they will also publish research. And by having this article level classification and also item level classification that moves throughout all the different content types, then you can just have a leveled view, in a way, of what is going on in the research landscape. So on top of publications and grants, there are also patents, clinical trials, data sets, and policy documents, which I've merged into just one slide. But all of them tell a different story. And you can use that kind of information in different types of analyses. So if you're doing research on the effects of tobacco on health, and you would want to analyze what kind of research is out there, but how did that research influence policy documents as well, you can do that just by looking into one database rather than multiple different ones. So I guess you can think of dimensions as multiple different databases in just one pot with all of the walls broken, and everything is interconnected. So you don't have to go into 3-4 different places and hire expensive analysts to do the data analysis for you when you can just use one database. And how is the data accessible? Let me just first open all of these hexagons. The main one, I guess, is the user interface. The user interface also has a free version, so all of the publication and data sets are free for everyone. It was built in a way that it is for researcher use, so you can go and use it mainly for discovery, because no one should pay for a discovery platform. And there is also a free API for badges, so if you want to add your badges to your repository, feel free to do that. But of course, there's a different type of API as well that is more analytical. So you could do complicated searches, like the example I think I mentioned earlier, which publications from nanotechnology from 2015 to 2019 that have been published by researchers in the Netherlands or generally in Europe have been mentioned in patents. So you can, and who are the assignees, have those patents received other citations from other patents, so you can get a little bit into the weeds and the details as well, that you can do with the API. And it is a very easy to use API. So we've created a special language for it. So it really is, just like I've mentioned earlier, just a bit of broken English, and you would search for publications and return publications or return authors, researchers, and so forth. And because our goal is to make the data as accessible as possible, there is also a Google Sheet integration. That is why this little button is here as well. So rather than having to go into a programmatic environment, you can just use Google Sheets, extract the data, and use basic Excel functions and queries to build actual dashboards. And I've done it myself. It is not complicated at all. And I'm not saying it for the sake of saying it, but I don't have any background in computer science. I've learned to use the API literally on the job, as well as complicated Excel functions. So if it's easy for someone like me, I'm mostly sure that it will be extremely easy for you guys. And of course, there's the bulk export. And why the API is different. What I mentioned earlier, that you can extract data for further analysis or build applications on top of the API without having to just live in our own ecosystem, but rather bring the data and put it into your own. Also, you can aggregate data into the query. That's how DSL was built. So the dimension search language was built. So you can search for publications in a particular time frame with other specific facets and then return just the countries, or you can aggregate the metrics for my search. And then this is actually my very favorite one. As a former librarian, metrics have always kind of been my soft spot. And being able to create the indicators that I need without having to just use the ones that are available has been very, very interesting for me. But most interesting has been how people have been using dimensions data to create their own metrics and analyses. And then use the entities like researchers, organizations, and countries, categories, etc., for analysis. This would also, these two together would of course empower you to have the analysis and the level of customization that you would need to create a strategy that works for your university or your organization. And I will skip this little one because I will go into a bit more details about what this is towards the end of the presentation. And this was actually what the presentation and the workshop today was supposed to be, well, is about: how to resolve your own affiliations using grid IDs and the Dimensions API. Because this has been a long-standing problem, I guess, that we ourselves found it or bumped into it as we started to build Dimensions. I see there is something in the chat. If you have any questions so far, please let me know. If not, I will just move to the next section. Where does Dimensions take its data? That is a very good question, Justine. We take it from various different places. So when it comes to publications, the backbone of the data comes from Crossref. But we also index the full text through another sister company within digital science called ReadCube, and they index the full text of publishers from all around the world. It would be, I guess, a little biased towards the very big one, but there are more and more of the small publishers as well. And then on paywall data, on top of, again, ReadCube data for all the open access information. Then for grants, so for the awarded grants, where we have the amounts as well, that comes primarily directly from funders. So we have a direct relationship with them. They give us the data through various different formats, so from Excel sheets to API connections, and we put them all in the same pot, in the same box, not the right word there. Then when it comes to patents, we get them from IFI Claims, which also happens to be a sister company within digital science. So we do get them from various different places, clinical trials from all the clinical trials registries, and the policy docs, they are curated by Altmetric and brought into Dimensions as well. So it is, yeah, it is bits and pieces from digital science, bits and pieces from other places as well. Thank you for your question. Okay, if there, oh, I see one more question. I forgot to say at the beginning that I absolutely love questions. The more questions you have, the better. As a former librarian, I absolutely love questions. As a lecturer, is it possible to design a private publication database for my faculty with such an environment? Of course you can. Because you can take the data, you can use the API and build all the dashboards as you need it. It can be with only publications, or it can be with anything else in it. But you can just use the data as it is. So yeah, you can slice and dice it as you need it. How do you verify whether the data are rightly recorded or not? Do you mean if we have the correct data about publications or grants, or if we have all the data that exists out there? Because my answer to both of them, I guess, would be there's not really a way of verifying either. When it comes to publication metadata, that falls into publisher realm. So we can identify that we have gaps in metadata, but fixing it would be something a publisher would do. What we can is just overlap data from multiple different sources and try and cover those gaps as much as possible. So for example, in Crossref, not all publishers deposit their references. So we just take them from ReadCube, and we try and display it in a way that you won't see it as a user, that there are brought from multiple different places, but rather you get just a uniform experience. Thank you. Right, so let's go to the next section. This one is about disambiguating external organization. And it is one of my favorite topics to talk about. And that is because it is a serious challenge for institutions around the world, and how to disambiguate partnering organizations, because CRIS systems would disambiguate organization, the actual local organization, but wouldn't be able to disambiguate, for the most part of them, partnering organizations from around the world. And as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to disambiguating organizations, there are multiple different challenges, starting from how authors write down their own affiliation. And I found some very interesting examples out there, down to the complex organizational structure. And we've bumped into this problem the minute we started building Dimensions. So as a response, I guess, we built Grid, which is an open source database. You can download it and use it as you need it as well. But it contains everything about an organization, and it is curated. There are currently about 98,000 different organizations that have something to do with research within GRID from all around the world. And it includes information like what is the type of that organization, what is the link, what are the different abbreviations, the different naming formats, parent organization, children organizations within that institution, the URL, Wikipedia URL, and so on. And all of it is given one identifier, which makes it very easy to use and then apply to different databases or for ourselves as well in Dimensions. And initially it was very much an internal process. So we would take unstructured affiliations or structured, run it through GRID, and then have it disambiguated into a GRID ID and have that used into Dimensions. But we wanted for everyone else to have the possibility to do the same thing. So now all of the GRID data has been merged with the Dimensions API, and you can push through unstructured affiliation or structured one, like in my examples here, and get a GRID ID that you can then put in your system. There you go. And there are additional perks. So you would have all the different identifiers of that organization when it was, when it appeared, so the year, and you can have analysis, for example, which organizations that are in technology that are newer than 10 years have publications that have been mentioned in patents. So that is a whole analysis in itself. And in a very cool graph that is not made by me, this is how it looks like. So we would take the information about the affiliation, run it through Dimensions, and then we would feed that data with the resolved affiliation and IDs into the system that you are using. And I do have an example of how that works. And with this occasion, I will also show you how the Dimensions search language works. So this is a notebook. It is built in Collaboratory. One of the systems that we use a lot internally, particularly with newbies like me, because I can start writing my own notebook and then add comments like you would use a Google Doc, really, and add one of my senior colleagues that can figure out what is wrong with my code. And just here you would log in, and this is how some affiliations would work. So you would just put in whatever you have about that affiliation, whether it's the name, the city, the state, the country, or just some of that information. This is the query that would extract it if you have it in a structured way. And this is for the unstructured part. So regardless of how you have the data, there are options of disambiguating all of that messy affiliation string. This notebook is a bit longer. It also shows how you can use it just to extract organizations from a particular city, or that just has this name somewhere in its name. Probably didn't wake up properly this morning. You can also look at various different, so you can use a Boolean to extract those names and so forth. But the disambiguation part is really just here. And regardless of how you have that, the structure, there's always a solution for that. And this will also be included in here. So once you get the slides, you can just click through the API example and look through the notebook as well. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. And I would also really, so for this particular part, what I would be interested in finding out is how you deal with this kind of data, how you're doing your own disambiguation Are you doing it at all? What are your suggestions, your feedback? What are the issues or the good things that you've encountered so far? And I will be monitoring the chat. Or if you would like to be unmuted, that would be great. I will also be monitoring the attendee list in case anyone raises their hand and would like to be unmuted. Do you find it interesting to have this kind of, would you use this kind of tool to disambiguate your own unresolved affiliation strings within your systems? Would you prefer not to? Oh, there was one question here. Please demonstrate shortly to import and export data from dimensions, how to collect full data, including the PDF of articles. I can't show part of that. Just give me a minute to come out of the full screen. Oops. So this is how the full version of dimensions looks like. It will load in just a minute. Hopefully my internet is still good enough for that. There it is. You can just have any search, plastic. It searches in the full data, as you see here. And just to see the difference, for full data search for plastic, it returns 5 million results. For title and abstract, it returns about 400,000. So the difference is considerable. And if you want to export, oops, just the full data, you can export in increments of 50,000 results in one go. So you would need to just slice it a bit more. And you can use the year for that. And you can use country of funder, I guess. Just going to take the first one. And from the user interface, this is how it would look like. You just export the results as an Excel or CSV. You get to choose whichever you want. In the API, I guess that was the next part. Oh, that is, just let me go through the, oh, so many questions, thank you. Let me just go through this. So you would export the data as a CSV or an Excel sheet and just use that. If you're using the API, then it would become so much easier because all of these slicing can be looped and then you would just get as much data as you need. But if you do need lots and lots of data, then we would probably find a different way of giving that to you. Let's go back to the questions. How can you tell, for example, 2 institutions or 2 authors are the same? Is there some objective way everyone can tell they are the same or different? Marcel, thank you so much for that question. That is a very, very good question. And we do use 2 different ways of disambiguating institutions and a different way to disambiguate authors. When it comes to, and neither of them are bulletproof, of course. When it comes to institutions, we would use grids. So if I go back to the example that I think I didn't explain properly. Institutions would appear under various different names. So you can, as an author, one day I could say I am affiliated with Dimensions in digital science. And another day I would say, oh, I'm just digital science. And another day I just feel like I should put digital science first and then Dimensions. And this would happen with researchers as well, with putting their university and then their department, or just their department. There was one example of a researcher saying they're part of department 1, or another researcher, instead of writing down their affiliation, they said they've been knighted by the Danish king, which neither of them are very helpful when disambiguating affiliations, and neither of them would get disambiguated. But for everything else, where there is the name of the university, then that would be very useful. To disambiguate and run it through GRID, because in GRID, apart from what you see, if you just go to GRID here, and just take the very first institution. So apart from what you see in the profile, behind that, there will also be various different naming formats, various languages, various alphabets that it has ever been written into, because this is at its core a manually curated database. So if I send an error report, there will be a human replying that has been fixed, and it will be updated with the next release. So it's not just an algorithm running wild. And what we are trying to solve with this is not just disambiguate Dimensions affiliations, but actually help you in your CRIS systems or your repositories or any other dashboards that you're using to be able to disambiguate affiliations just the same. When it comes to author disambiguation, we're taking a slightly different route. So we're looking at the grants that have been awarded to this particular person and the affiliation that person had when it was awarded the grant. Also the discipline they are publishing in. So we're generally taking the last 3 years of publications and grants and trying to match where that person has been affiliated within those years, what are their disciplines that they're publishing in, and what is the discipline that they've gotten grants into. And the algorithm kind of has been fine-tuned to disambiguate. Again, it doesn't mean it's bulletproof. There will always be errors with this type of automated disambiguation, whether we're talking people or institutions. But it's been doing a pretty good job to date. Does that answer the question, Marcel? Radim, does GRID work like ORCID in allowing organizations to curate their data? Yep, that is actually that is the comparison I always make. So you can think of GRID like ORCID, but for institutions. So thank you for that. And then, good morning. Could you explain in a bit more detail what problem the API is trying to solve? Or what task it is trying to simplify? For example, what task can be undertaken using the unstructured search results that were yielded with the help of the API? That is a very, very good question. There are multiple different problems that the API is trying to solve, starting with the fact that it is one API that has all the different content types. So you can do advanced analysis based on the API without having to pull the data from different sources. But when it comes specifically to the disambiguation part, the difference between the structured affiliation string and the unstructured one is down to the systems that you have. So if you have a system that has structured affiliations, then we would use that to disambiguate and have just one ID. And there was one institution with which we have tested this, And I wouldn't want to say any wrong numbers. Let me just, whoops. So when you have different partners, organizations, the same organization can appear multiple different times. And rather than when you build collaboration network with your own data, rather than using an external system, you would want to know if you have one organization 350 times or just once. So with this integration, you would just disambiguate all of these affiliations to just one, and be able to have a very, not a very accurate, but a significantly more accurate representation of your collaborators and your partners from all around the world. And you can have analyses based on your data, which will always be significantly more accurate than any other system out there, regardless of open and inclusive that system is. Your data would always be better. And we would want you to use, of course, your own data and help as much as possible with curating it, adding additional value to it, such as citations or mentions in patents and so forth. Does that help? It does. Thank you. Thank you for a question. That was a very good question. There any more questions? Oops. Never clicked the right buttons. Okay, so as I mentioned, there will be a 10-minute break just if you want to stretch. Bring a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, whichever you prefer. And I will be right here if you have further questions. If you would like to be unmuted, feel free to let me know. I'm not moving anywhere. But I will see you in 10 minutes.